kids coming into the technology world today don't have this visceral connection with the machine that was there in the past. Like I have kids who come in to my upper division classes who don't understand what a file system is. And it's not their fault. You don't blame the kids, you blame the parents, right? Like, and the parents in this case are like us. AI just makes it so that they don't have to do it if they don't want to. They can just, they can get 100%. And so this previous semester was crazy. Like everyone got A's on all the coding assignments. Everyone got an A, 100%. So what I'm doing this semester is I am
Welcome to Software Unscripted. I'm your host, Richard Feldman. Today I'm talking with Carson Gross, creator of the HTMX library for doing lean, lightweight front-end web development in sort of the old school Ajax-y hypermedia kind of way, as opposed to the more newer school, bloated, single-page application kind of way that seems to be popular these days. We talk about all sorts of concepts from backwards compatibility, how he jumped from HTMX version 2 to HTMX version 4. It's a funny story behind that. As well as the overall philosophy of breaking software changes, what you should work on once a software library is really kind of done, software in general, how AI is affecting all of this, and also Carson's experiences teaching over the past 5 years and how you might be surprised to learn that the course that has actually changed the most is his low-level hardware course. The hardware itself hasn't changed, but his reasons for why the course has been evolving and changing might surprise you. I want to thank everybody who's been supporting Software Unscripted on Patreon. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. And of course, if you're on Patreon, you're going to get ad-free episodes. Thank you all so much. And if you want to become a subscriber on Patreon, check out patreon.com/softwareunscripted. Thank you to Mailtrap for sponsoring this episode of Software Unscripted. If you don't know Mailtrap, or you only know them for email testing, they are a modern email delivery system for developers. They support things like straightforward integration into your code with native SDKs, or they have a security-compliant API and also SMTP access. In their free tier, you get 4,000 emails monthly, so it's pretty easy to try out. And they also have 24/7 support where you talk to real humans, not AI chatbots. If that's the type of thing you're interested in because you do email delivering at your business, check out mailtrap.io to learn more. All right, Carson, welcome back.
Thank you. Well, glad to be back.
The first thing I wanted to ask you about is HTMX 4. Now, this is a significant upgrade over HTMX 3, which doesn't exist.
Doesn't exist. Yeah.
You want to just tell the story briefly?
It's just classic, best laid plans. So HTMX 2, which was the, is the current major release of HTMX. I think the last version was middle of last year, maybe later last year. But we wrote an essay, I think back in August, basically, of 2025, this early 2026 at this point. And maybe even a little bit before that. But me and Alex, who's one of the other core people on the project, were like, we really want to focus on stability and we need to keep this library because it got popular, and we don't want people to have to deal with bad, with upgrade pain, which is I would say upgrade pain is one of the characteristics of front end development, right? And also increasingly back end development. I kind of cut my teeth in the Java world where there was more of a focus on backwards compatibility. Not always, but when things broke, it was because it really was a major version, and there weren't that many major versions. JUnit, which is an ancient testing framework in the Java world, is at 5 right now. And that's in contrast to something not that I have any experience with this, so I can't talk competently about it, but I think Next.js is on the whatever, in the teens or something like that. And so we wanted to go the other way. And I do have to say jQuery is an example of a library that is focused relentlessly on backwards compatibility, to the point that at times it's harmed that project, probably just because they're unwilling to take out stuff that was not useful anymore, that aged poorly or whatever it was. So we were inspired by jQuery. I would say, at least I was. I like jQuery a whole bunch. I think it's still a very useful project, and I wouldn't be ashamed to use it at all. And so we wrote this article saying look, HTMX is done, and we're not going to do it. I don't think I said explicitly we're not going to do a 3.0, but I know I said in conversations and in podcasts and so forth, we're not going to do a 3.0. And cool, that appeals to me. It still appeals to me pretty significantly. But also, HTMX2 came out of the HTMX1 lineage, which came out of intercooler.js, which was built on jQuery. And when HTMX1 started, Internet Explorer was still a thing. I know that's like people now have probably forgotten all about it,
Oh no, no,
but
no.
but yeah, so Internet Explorer was still a thing, and so it was built around the XHR object for doing Ajax, for making requests, HTTP
Ajax, yeah.
requests. Yeah, Ajax, good old Ajax.
Oh yeah.
XHR, and so that's really what the HTMX 2.1 especially, and then 2.0, because it would have been too much at the time to redo everything. People had been saying, "Oh, you should use fetch. You should use fetch." And I looked at it, and whatever. But there was always the reality. There's this unfortunate situation where XHR has functionality. Obviously, fetch has functionality that XHR doesn't have. That's like, of
Right.
course, it's newer. It's got all the new stuff. But also, XHR has stuff that Fetch doesn't have yet.
Interesting.
Yeah, like upload events tracking.
Oh, I
Like
didn't know
you
that.
don't, you don't. They just never added those to Fetch. And I'm like constitutionally a cautious person when it comes to software that's already out there and working. Like, I like the jQuery approach. And so I looked at that and was like, well, it's good enough. XHR is good enough. It's not going anywhere. And it has this additional functionality that Fetch doesn't have. And I don't really want to go through, because it's, the two APIs are very different than one another. And so I just, we talked about doing it for 2.0, but just decided not to do it. The other thing that happened at that point early last year, is I wrote a library called Fixie.js. Have you heard of Fixie.js?
Only from your blog post.
Okay, so that was my attempt. I was like, someone's going to make like the minimalist version of HTMX at some point, and it might as well be me. And so that is like a very minimalist take on the HTMX pattern. Like, I strip out all the niceties just down to the raw core of what it is. You have to do a ton of scripting if you want to do real world work with it. But some people like that. Like, they want to write the code and then have this very minimalist kernel for doing the HTTP, requests and swaps and so forth. And in doing that, I learned a lot more about fetch, and was like, okay, like, I get it. Like, async, I wasn't super comfortable with async in JavaScript before I did Fixie. But when I did Fixie, I got more comfortable with it and was like, okay, like, I see now how this could simplify HTMX. And so that's really what kicked off this, like, you know what, we really should,
Yeah.
unfortunately, we're going to do one more, at least
Right.
one more, because this really is like, the infrastructure that's there now is much better than what we've got, which is all callbacks. And you kind of get used to that old crazy callback hell situation in JavaScript, but just looking at the code in Fixie and looking at the code in HTMX for similar features, it's like, okay, I get now how this would really help quite a bit. Like, I'm not just a total fanboy of the way JavaScript did async, but it's better in many ways than callback hell. And so at that point, I just kind of had this knocking around in my head, and then I got a DM from, like an act of God, just a DM from someone who was like, hey, like, I'm kind of interested in exploring this. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. Like, I was just thinking, like, I was just really agonizing over whether or not I should do this, because I told everyone, I mean, how embarrassing is this? I tell everyone, like, oh, we're not going to do it anymore. And I was like, no, we are going to, we're going to do at least one more. And that's when I came up with the idea of like, okay, we're not going to do a 3, because I told people we're not going to do a 3, but I never said anything about 4. so we'll call the next one 4.0 instead. And then that's what led into this. And so we've been working on 4.0 now for, I don't know, a couple months, and it came together really quickly. It's on Alpha 6, but it has most of the functionality. I expect to go into beta like in probably February,
Very
and
cool.
then a release that's probably some point in like the May June timeframe, an initial release. And we're going to do the same thing we did with 2.0, where we're going to keep 2.0 current. That'll be current, and then 4.0 will be next, and we'll do that for a year so that people have time to like get their feet under them as like if they want to do the upgrade or not. And then 2.0 will be supported forever, just like 1.0 is, because people who need IE support have to use 1.0. 2.0 wasn't IE compatible. So
Gotcha.
that's kind of where we are.
Okay, cool. Well, so I have some like thoughts and questions. So first question that comes to mind is just to clarify the async part. That's what requires the breaking change. It's almost
Yeah.
an upstream thing. It's like if you want to use fetch because fetch is async, you have no choice but to break your API and offer an async based API, right?
Yeah, and just the APIs, it's as much as I wish I could have like completely contained within HTMX the XHR world. It bled out into the API in certain
Mm-hmm.
ways. There's just things that aren't. It's a dynamic programming language, so there's all these like little things. You do it this way here and that way there,
Right.
and so. My hope is that fetch remains like the main way to do it pretty much in perpetuity, in which case then I think there's less of an argument for hopefully doing another big upgrade. I mean, I know it's like famous last words, but I do want this to be like, okay, this is sort of our final answer for what we think the implementation should look like. The actual use of the library is very similar.
Mm-hmm.
It's very similar. So all the standard HTMX attributes are there. HX get, HX post, HX target, like they all work the same for the most part. And interestingly, over time, when I first did it, it was like, oh, this is great because I can tear out all this legacy stuff. And then slowly I've gone back and been like, oh, that's why we did that. Okay, I get it now. And so it's ended up looking a lot more like HTMX4 looks a lot more like HTMX2 than it did when I first conceived of it. Just because it's like, oh yeah, that actually is useful in like practical situations. So we do need to do that. So kind of interesting.
Yeah, well, this gets into, I think, the question of like, where do you draw the line of it's okay to break and why? So, on like one
Uh-huh.
extreme, you have the Linux kernel policy of in all caps, we do not break user space, period. Right? Doesn't matter
Mm-hmm.
what the reason is, you just don't do it. And
Mm-hmm.
then that's like extreme hardline versus you have at the extreme opposite end, like you said, a lot of the JavaScript ecosystem is very high on churn. And I think
Mm-hmm.
part of what bothers people about that is the frequency of the change. But also, I think another thing that bothers people about it is just like the capriciousness of it, like just how
Right.
arbitrary it seems. It's like you didn't need to do that. Why did you change? It feels like you're changing it for the sake of changing it, or just because you want to
Yeah.
try out. Hey, maybe this other way is cool too. And it, it's different. I think if you're like, look, there's stuff in the layer below me that I cannot give you access to unless
Right.
I make this breaking change. And
Yeah.
even in the Linux world, like maybe they're like, we still don't do, even if the hardware, for example, changes or something like that, that,
Mm-hmm.
they have this hardcore policy. But I don't know, for a JavaScript framework, it seems like a reasonable place to draw the line of we're only going to change if the underlying thing sort of forces our hand. And it's
Yeah.
our two options are just you can't use that underlying thing that you want to, or we have to make a breaking change to give you the option.
Right. Yeah, and I appreciate you saying that because it makes me feel less bad. I like the Linux policy, but it just, and I have to say, like in doing this work, I do see there's so many trade-offs, right? Like you have to trade off between these things. And I am naturally a very conservative person when it comes to code. Like I don't want to do a big new thing. I don't like, hold on, let's do it. I'm always like incremental, like let's do
Mm,
this incrementally and keep backwards compatibility. And that's good, I think, in a lot of cases, but there's also times when it's bad. And I do have to say, looking now that I've gone through this experience, looking back, like I probably should have done this in 2.0 like that,
mm,
it's hindsight's 2020 and all the rest of it. But I wasn't in a place where I could, I didn't have the experience with Fetch. didn't have experience with async. I knew the old way of doing things, and so I just wasn't in the right spot. And so, I think now I'm paying the price for that. On the other hand, hopefully, there are benefits that come from that as well. And also, I think one thing we're committed to is supporting the older versions. Like there's most people, if you look on the stats online, most people are on HTMX1 still.
Mm.
And, we intend to support that forever. The good news with HTMX is the core of it is so simple that it's not that hard to support a few versions of it. And there's typically workarounds for most problems anyways. And so, we don't need to release a whole bunch of patches. We just need to point people to like, okay, if you want to do that, here's this. So.
Well, so speaking of like incremental, I think the closure approach to this would be you make an HX and then you have an HX2, and they're both part of the same library, and you can mix and match and sort of upgrade incrementally. Obviously, the ability to make that sort of free for end users from a bundle size perspective kind of requires that they're able to have good enough. I'm going to say dead code elimination. I know tree shaking is the term everybody uses, but it's DCE. Come on. But was that something that you really considered, or was that sort of like, no, that's going to make the code base a disaster, and or other reasons?
No, I never considered that. Maybe I should have. But we got branches. So if you want to do, I don't see a good reason to mix and match the different versions of HTMX. It's like, if you want the HTMX2 way, do it with HTMX2. And they're really not that different. I think for the average, say like 80% of HTMX users, they're going to be able to upgrade to HTMX4 in like, a couple lines of code, because it's just not that different. The biggest change, and you can undo it with a config. That's another thing that we do, is we have a lot of config options. And so you can flip behaviors back to the old way if you want. Cool. And so like what are the major changes? Hold on, I got to find this. The major changes in HTMX4, one of them is we're going from implicit attribute inheritance to explicit attribute inheritance. So the most common attribute that I would say is inherited is HX target, which tells HTMX where you want to place stuff in the DOM, the response, where you want to place that in the DOM. And that has HTMX2 and one before it, and intercooler before that, always had this notion of inheritance, where if you put an HX target on a parent element, then all of the children beneath it inherited that. So they would have the same target, and that's nice, because then you don't have to put target on like 50 things or whatever. Right. But it's also bad, because if that like ends up in some other file, some other template file, or somewhere far away, and someone changes that, then suddenly they can be changing the behavior of a lot of stuff. And this is one of these trade-offs in engineering, where it's like locality, like, being more verbose, makes things independent, but, then you have a bunch more junk that you have to deal with. But then if you kind of try and extract that somewhere else, now it's easier to update all that stuff. It's more normalized in some ways, but also it can be harder to understand exactly what the behavior is for a given, if you're looking at, an HTMX powered button, like what's the target? Oh, you have to look up here, or even worse, if it's in another file, you got to go look in some other file to understand it. And so in 4, we said, okay, we're going to make the default that attributes aren't inherited. And if you want them to be inherited, then you have to mark them with a : inherited modifier. So like HX target : inherited equals whatever. And then you're making at that point, you're making an explicit decision, like, I am sacrificing locality of behavior, if you ever read that essay that I wrote, and I'm making that choice here. And then when you look at it, that choice is being made. Like, even if you don't totally understand what attribute inheritance is, if you see that and you're like, wait a minute, what is this : inherited thing? Like, okay, now it'll communicate that. So that was our solution to that problem. Now, I have to say, I had always viewed this as like a mistake that I made super early in like intercooler days, and it just kind of lived on because it would have been so hard. And if you go back and look at HTMX2, there's a lot of like weird functionality to help people deal with inheritance. Like you can disinherit and blah, it's just all
Hmm.
this stuff. And like, so I was like, well, obviously everyone hates this, and so I'm going to finally fix it for them, and they're going to be so happy with me. And I put this out, and then I got a bunch of like, what's the matter with inheritance? We love it. Like, it's fine. Why are you touching my stuff? And it's like, oh, just goes to show you never know. But I do think in the long run it'll be better for the maintenance of HTMX based applications if we go to explicit inheritance. So I would say that's the big change. Besides the
Yeah.
internals going to fetch.
It's funny. Like the most famous form of inheritance is, of course, like method inheritance and object-oriented programming, which is, famously disfavored in favor of composition.
Right.
But I have to say, when it comes to like nested UI elements and like a tree of them, I think
Hmm.
the trade-offs are pretty significantly different. I mean, the one that really
Yeah.
stood out to me was I was thinking about this because I work at Zed and we have our own sort of homegrown like UI
Hmm.
framework, and I was kind of thinking about like how it works and stuff like that, and and it's all in Rust, so there's no like CSS, that you have to like opt out of. It's just like they
Right.
built everything from scratch, so you get to answer these questions like, do you want to have any kind of inheritance? And one that jumped out at me is like fonts. It's like if you don't have inheritance, do you want to specify for this container, this
Yeah.
this panel here, every single tiny button and label and whatnot inside there all has to say use this font,
Yeah.
versus do you want to say this container has this font and everybody inside just by default inherits what its parent has? It's like, no, yeah, I want the second thing for sure. That's just like
Yeah.
really obvious.
Exactly. And it's as always like there's a continuum. It's like this is as
Yeah,
good as it gets. Like sometimes one is obviously better, sometimes the other is obviously better. Sometimes they both would be good in some sense, but and bad in some sense. Like it's just you got to, it's hard to pick. And so I think I do think that explicit inheritance is better. I think inheritance is good in certain cases with HTMX, with the HTMX API. But I think that explicit inheritance is probably the ideal, where it's like, okay, we support that, but you have to do it. And then if you're wondering why something changed, you can do a global search through the code base for inherited. And oh, okay, like it's because this thing's including that, and like whatever, it's marked as inherited, and then you can make that decision.
that kind of reminds me of like Rust has this like mutable modifier where it's like the default
Hmm.
is immutable, but you can opt into mutation on a case by case basis. So it's like if you're wondering why something changed, you can go look and see what, like, was it marked as mutable
Yeah.
or not.
Yeah, I will say that I tried when I designed the new explicit inheritance, and this is one thing I dislike about async in JavaScript is I wanted to make it so that you didn't have to bleed the change through.
Mm,
So like in JavaScript, one thing that stinks, I think, with async is that if you want to await something, you have to mark it as async. And
right.
then that means you have to do it through the entire code base. And there are good technical reasons for doing that. I get it. Like,
Yeah.
don't yell at me about that stuff. I wrote hyperscript, which like makes that go away as much as possible. So that means I also know it is possible to not have to do that.
Yep.
So they could have done the runtime where you don't have to mark anything as async and you
Right.
just await, and then the runtime works it out. It'd be different in many ways than what it currently does, but what I dislike about that current sort of situation is when you start putting async on stuff, or excuse me, when you start awaiting stuff, that bleeds out through the whole like code base. Like everything has to be annotated as async. And I just ran into this recently because one of the things I've been working on for my students here at Montana State is an online emulator of a CPU. It's like a very visual, like blah 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 thing. And I wanted to store the file system in IndexedDB, which is like
Yep.
the new thing
Yeah.
for local storage, and it's
It's not
much
that new. It's
bigger.
like 20 years old, I think.
Yeah, 20 years, but okay. So new to me, new to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I've never, because I've just never. I mean, I'm a Hadios guy, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
I want everything in the document. And so the but that API is async,
Yep.
and so if you want to use it, like if I want to use it in like I'm emulating like system calls where I'm writing a file or whatever, and that's where I'm storing my file system. then you end up the async. Okay, now a syscall has to do it. Okay, well now your eval loop or your emulation loop has to be async, and then okay, now your emulation loop's async, and like where does this just spirals out of control? And so I really dislike that aspect of the JavaScript async implementation. And that was something that was on my mind when I was trying to design inheritance. So hopefully doesn't get as crazy. So anyways.
Yeah, I don't know why they chose to go the route I mean, it seems like a lot of languages do. I don't actually know, like, understand the technical reasoning behind it, because it seems like, for example, Go doesn't do that. Like, Go just
Right,
has everything is sort of IO is always silently non-blocking. So when you hit
right,
like do an HTTP request, then like the next line doesn't execute until that finishes. So it's sort of like implicit await. And then of course, if you want to run things in parallel, you just have different ways to express that. Like you could have
right.
just a promise.all equivalent that's like, okay, now you do have to give some callbacks, but they won't nest a bunch because it's just for that,
Yeah,
little do these things in parallel or
right,
concurrently, I guess, in JS, because only got one thread. But
right.
um, I don't know what the reasoning was behind that, or if it was just sort of, this is how it's done, this is how others are doing it, so we're going to kind of follow suit. Wish I could have been a fly on the wall in the TC39 meetings for to know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be too hard on it. It's hard, designing a language and a good runtime. I design a bunch of like toy, runtimes, and even those are hard. And so, getting like one thing we're experiencing now is just getting agreement across the browsers. Like, you've
Mm,
got two or three different teams that are, with some pretty significant opinions, very technical people. Getting them to all agree on something can be pretty tricky. So.
sure.
There's technical reasons, and I'm most familiar with the technical evolution of Java because that's
Mm,
just like what I grew up coding in, and I saw so many like bad decisions just
sure.
made in that language over its lifetime, and a lot of it was, I think interpersonal stuff. Like the guy who got to implement X got to implement it because he was an old time Sun guy and knew the, whatever, and just so so many technical decisions are because of non-technical reasons. I think it can be very frustrating, but also like I think we have to be a little sympathetic that like this is the way human institutions work. So
Yeah, right. Like you can be upset about it while still understanding why it is the way it is.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. That makes sense. Well, so speaking of things that are frustrating, I saw this sort of news story about Tailwind CSS talking about how sort of Tailwind's an open source library for styling things on the web.
yeah,
Um, there was also a company that I guess the creators of Tailwind formed to sort of be able to monetize and be able to like pay themselves to work on the open source thing, because open source
sure,
by default doesn't pay anything. And they mentioned that they had to do a lot of layoffs. I think they had 8 people working on it full time, and they had to lay off 3 of them, like 3 out of 4, the 4 engineers, and I guess the others are sales and other things. I'm not sure.
mm-hmm.
And it seemed like the reasoning they gave was that a lot of I guess a lot of people found out about their paid stuff through the documentation that they have. And
Right,
I know this is not something that HTMX does, but I'm kind of guessing that there might be some indirect pipeline because you have a consultancy, and then you have HTMX, and I'm assuming that some people will find out about the consultancy via HTMX. I'm kind of curious if that's, I don't know if you've seen anything similar where they were saying that like because people are using AI so much, they're not reading the docs as much directly, and so they're not seeing the promotion of the business. I don't know. Has that been anything you've noticed or?
I no, not for me. Well, so my monetization of HTMX, two things I'd say about it. First of all, it's almost all through sponsorships,
Mhm.
and the sponsors get, an image. If you pay like $100 a month or whatever, you get a link on the HTMX homepage. And I think part of the value proposition of that is the traffic that
Yeah.
.org gets, and so in as much as AI is making that traffic disappear, I could see people that are doing it solely because they want the traffic, being like, and we do have people every once in a while. They're like, "Hey, I love HTMX. Here's my like social media gaming like thing or whatever. It's like, probably
Yeah.
not. You probably just want a high quality link to your website. But like, okay, like, we built HTMX, and, I'm pretty outrageous on Twitter. And so that a lot of people go and check out HTMX because of that. So like, whatever, we can trade that off. Um, but so I, I think it could affect us in that regard, in that it just makes online, presence less valuable. Um, but on the other hand, I have always treated any money that I get from HTMX as fake, because I don't trust any. I don't want to have my life, or anyone who is depending on me, on their life, dependent on such an ephemeral thing. Like,
Mm.
I got to think, as soon as the economy gets a little bit tight, like, all these open source sponsorships are going to go away, and I don't want to be the guy that's, like, has like, okay, now I'm screwed. So I really have tried very hard. I do have one sponsor who, their sponsorship is kind of more of a consulting relationship, or as much that, because I work for them. But the other sponsorships, I just try and pretend it's not there. And so I think open source, the open source funding is tough. Like, I don't know, I don't have a good solution for it. I've seen some interesting kind of mixed models, but a lot of them kind of feel very rug pulley to me,
Mm.
at some level. HTMX is not a big library. Like, Tailwinds is a much larger code base than HTMX, and so I just don't I just don't think HTMX. I've had, so there was, in, like, I think, was it 2024, HTMX was just like vertical. And so I started getting calls from like VCs and whatever. And they were like, oh, we love what you're doing. I'm like, you don't know what I'm doing. Like, but like, what's your long-term plan? And I'm like, there is no plan. like,
Yeah.
like it's very hard to monetize something like HTMX. I just, yeah, and HyperScript even more so. Like, who cares about this obscure programming
Yeah.
thing? And
No,
so,
I got VC cold emails about for Rock too.
yeah,
Pretty
exactly.
good numbers, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And it's flat. Like, it's like, okay, cool. That's neat. That was a neat time, because like everyone was looking at HTMX, but I don't see much money in it. I think it's just like a basic tool that people can use. And so I've tried to structure, as much as possible. I teach, and so teaching is not the best pay in the world, but it does have time. You do have flexible time, and so that makes it easier for me to find spots to do the open source work that I care about. So that's the way I do it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm kind of the same way with Rock, where like we have sponsors. It's just like link on the homepage. Actually, we have had recently people ask about things more about like, in the docs, or like, could you, if you're going to do an example of how to do blah, could you use us as the example of how to do blah, and we'll
Yeah.
pay you for that. Which is something I'm open to, but yeah, at the same time, I'm pretty happy to be just like having a full-time job that's totally decoupled from Rock, and just like
Yeah.
sponsorship can be used to pay people as contractors to work on the language, or for
Right.
tooling. But yeah, not to have the conflict of interest, at least in my view, as like the person running the project, of being like, well, now I need to make decisions about like, there's like the business side of Rock, and the what I think is actually
Totally.
best for the language. I'm like, there is no business side of Rock, so I don't have to
Yeah.
worry about that. But I get it. I
Yeah.
mean, it's hard to. I mean, unless you're starting off being like, this is a business and we're going to make an open source project as part of the business, and that's like there's a strategy for how to fit that in, like there is with Zed.
Hmm.
That makes sense to me. Or like, I guess maybe the biggest financial success story of this would be HashiCorp. Probably was like,
Right.
that was never going to be like, hey, as far as I know. I mean, I guess I had Mitchell on recently, but I didn't think to ask him. But as far as I know, the plan there was always to have a business. It was not just like,
Right.
let's just make these fun tools and then see if we can monetize later. It seems like it's much harder to do it after the fact, after you've already had a successful open source project, trying to turn that into a business that it wasn't really built to be from the ground up.
Yeah, 100%. And also the type of thing, like who's going to pay for, who's going to pay for a front end library that's like JavaScript? Like, I don't know. I mean, I guess Vercel's kind of made a business model out of it, but they've been focused more on like the deployment and like all that stuff. And so they have more of a Google attitude towards these things where it's like, okay, we're going to support open source because it helps our business, but we're not trying to monetize the open source directly the way that
Right.
someone like Tailwinds has to.
And especially if it's like front end and open source, because you do have stuff like Tiny MCE or like
Hmm.
various charting libraries where it's like, no, this is proprietary in front end. Like you can have it, but like you
Hmm.
cannot, you don't have the license to do all the usual open source stuff,
Right.
which is a business model. But I'm assuming that's never something you'd consider for any of your projects.
No, I kind of was, I don't like what do I don't want to say I don't like. I understand the GPL folks, but I don't share their like insistence on, whatever. And so all my stuff is BSD 0, which is
Mm,
basically public domain.
yeah.
And I think the good thing about that license is it takes that whole question off the table. Like there's no monetizing this, and so I just when I started getting serious about open source work, I mean the other thing is like intercooler was out there as an open source forever, and like nobody cared. So and then HTMX, nobody cared at first, and then suddenly everybody cared for like 1 year, and now people are kind of like, okay, now it's just a tool they use, which is a good thing. That's the normal curve. And what's up?
Why was it that people didn't seem to care about intercooler and then didn't seem to care about HTMX and then suddenly they did?
I think, there's just, we live in history, like there's a historical process that occurs, it's so easy when you're an engineer to be like, okay, this is clearly the right way to do things, or like there's a Platonistic tendency amongst engineers where, and I think there's just, we had to go through sort of, we had to go through JavaScript maximalism and discover, and there's a lot of good stuff about JavaScript, things about JavaScript and the SPA approach, the JSON, tied to what I would call a thick front end approach. But there's also a lot of drawbacks, and that's okay. Like it's okay to admit that
Yeah.
because it's engineering and there are trade-offs. And so I think the industry kind of had to go through this, like, okay, try, doing everything in JavaScript, and then, okay, there's some problems here. And at that point, HTMX was right place, right time to be an alternative, like a legitimate alternative. I remember, I think, someone, right? What's right? Something right? Um, oh gosh, I'm blocking on his first name. He writes a whole bunch. Tom Wright? I don't know. He wrote an article saying like this is the standard now. The SPA tied to a
Mm,
JSON API is the standard now, and there are problems with it. What are the alternatives? And it
mm.
was like, hypermedia is an alternative, and HTMX was probably the loudest hypermedia alternative at the time, and so just it was a historical process. So I think you do have to look at these things in like historical terms too. It's like why did people not glom onto intercooler JS? Because the world wasn't ready for what it was, and also it had a jQuery dependency. So like in the
Mm.
mid 2010s, it felt kind of old and gronky, and so just things like that. So
Okay.
I think that's what happened.
So it wasn't like it changed, but rather that the world around it changed such that there
Hmm.
became much more interest in what it already did.
Hmm.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and I that's not technical. It's just again a historical process. So.
Okay. Well, speaking of historical process and the world changing, you mentioned you're doing a lot of teaching. And I think you've been doing it for 5+ years now, something like that.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, it's my
and
sixth.
you teach a variety of different topics. It's not just like web development. It's like going into hardware and compilers and stuff like that. So
Right.
I'm pretty curious, like which of your courses have changed the most and which have changed the least over that time? Because I'm guessing the hardware stuff probably not so much, but maybe like web development more, and maybe there's ways in which they've all changed.
Yeah, exactly the opposite.
Really?
My hardware class has changed the most to the point that I feel bad for the kids because the problem with The problem with the hardware part of it, the hardware class I teach, which is 366, which is what I was doing, that emulator I was talking about earlier, is for that class. And it's called systems programming. And what it is it's like a soup to nuts. Like, here's how transistors work, and then here's how we can build an adder out of transistors, and then, okay, here's how a CPU kind of marches data around, and then, like, here's what assembly looks like, and it just goes sort of like up the abstraction stack. And that class, what has changed dramatically about it is my understanding of that material. Because when I came, I told the students this, like, this is this class that knocked me out of computer science as an undergraduate at Berkeley. I took the class with Patterson, of Patterson and Hennessy fame. And I was just like, he was one of the designers of MIPS, the MIPS chip, and so he's very competent, obviously, just like one of those sort of demigods that were sort of walking around at the time in Berkeley and Stanford. And he taught this class, and I was just not there. I was like, he was here, and I was not there. And so that was the class that knocked me out of Berkeley. And when I came to MSU to teach, and they were like, hey, we need someone to teach this class, you're doing it because you're the new guy. It took a lot of work to figure out, first of all, okay, like, I got to go back and relearn all this material as best I can, but then also working out how that particular class, how it failed to teach me what was going on. And so as I got more comfortable with material and sort of, and that's why it's changed so much, is I've sort of progressed in my understanding of, okay, this is the material, but also how do I communicate this the best way to the students? And that's why, if you go, like, you can look up the Montana mini computer, although we're doing a new version of it for this semester. It's a very visual representation of computers, because I think one of the things that kids coming into the technology world today don't have is this visceral connection with the machine that was there in the past. Like, if your experience with computing, like, I have kids who come in to my upper division classes who don't understand what a file system is, because and it's not their fault. You don't blame the kids, you blame the parents, right? Like, and the parents in this case are like us, like the older people. You look at the operating systems now, like, I can't tell you how many students I've gone and I've been like, okay, we're going to sit down and we're going to figure out, we're going to debug this. I'm really big on debuggers for their educational value. And I'll sit down and it's going incredibly slow. And I look, and it's because they've got their Git repository checked out on OneDrive, because Microsoft, like, hid everything from them to try and trick them into putting everything on OneDrive.
Oh, wow.
And so they don't even have really, like, that, like, and so even we, as, older developers, I feel like we don't have the visceral connection with the machine. The people who grew up with, like, the PDP-11 or the VAX with, like, the blinking lights and, like, oh, okay, there's a register. Like, I can see it. There's there are LEDs for the register right there. And so that's really what this class has evolved towards over the 5.5 years I've been teaching it, is like, it's not so much that the material has changed, although I've picked different things, like, okay, this is too complicated. Like, I did MIPS for a long time, and then it's like, MIPS is like, nobody cares about MIPS anymore. And so we're gonna do x86 for all the problems with x86, but then we're gonna do a simplified version of x86, so it's not quite as ugly. And so it's really changed quite a bit because of that. Not because the content has changed so much as just my trying to figure out the best way to teach it has changed.
Okay, now I'm a little hung up on this file system thing. So
yeah,
I understand, if you are using computers at home and you've never run into a file system, but I'm pretty surprised that someone could get through a computer science program and get to, like, upper level courses and not have encountered a file system in, like, any programming course or operating systems course or anything. Like, that's pretty wild to me.
Yeah, like, when I say they don't understand file systems, I don't want to say that they can't use them, like, at a very basic way. But when you ask them questions like, where did you put this? they don't really know where what
The
that
cloud.
means. Like where is this? Oh, it's here. I'm like, okay, but where is that? Is that on your machine or is that, and again, I blame like the operating system vendors are just horrible. Microsoft's horrible. What they're doing with Windows is just unconscious. It's not good. Whatever that term is.
Yeah.
It's really, really bad obviously very user hostile. I think Cory Doctor has a lot of good stuff on this. It's very user hostile, but it's also, it's just very for the people who want to understand technology better, and Apple, I've always struggled. Apple, I'm an Apple person. I'm on a Mac right now. I just grew up with Macs. And Apple has always tried to hide the details.
Yeah.
And I think almost by accident, they stopped hiding the details when sort of, Next took over as like the next
Yeah.
as the operating system. And they're like, okay, we got a Unix now, but like they still have this sort of like desire to hide all the details of the computer. And I just think, there's sometimes that's good. Like iOS is sort of the pinnacle of that. Like, and as much as Apple wants the desktop to just be iOS, but with like more Windows and maybe mouse support, I think that's really bad. So I'm unhappy with the OS folks right now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of surprised that. I mean, I guess it makes sense, but certainly used Windows when I was in college. But I kind of assumed by now that there would be more, if not Mac OS, then maybe Linux use in classrooms. But I guess now that I think about it, it's like, why would that have changed in the last?
Yeah, it's
20
tough
years?
because you really, people who are installing Linux is tricky. It's gotten a lot easier for sure, but it's just a big risk.
Mhm.
And so many of the kids here, like they're not super wealthy. They've got like one 4-year-old computer that would honestly probably run Linux way better than Windows, but it's their only thing. And
Yeah.
like, if they go through and they bork their computer, then they lost all their games, all this other stuff. And so, I don't know. I don't have a good solution for it, except for Microsoft and Apple behaving better, but I don't know how to do that.
Yeah. No, I mean, it makes sense from their perspective for sure.
Yeah. Financially, it makes sense.
Right, right.
But
Okay, so what about? I mean, we talked about AI's impact on like documentation and stuff like that
yeah.
for open source projects. What about the classroom? I mean, I hear a lot about at a high level. It's like it's changing things, but I don't really have a
Yeah.
sense of specifically like what and how is different.
It has made cheating incredibly prevalent.
Mm,
In that it makes, previously students, for if they wanted to cheat in my class. So historically, I have always been code heavy classes.
mhm,
Like I want you to write code. The quizzes that we do have are relatively a low percentage of your grade, um, because I want you to learn how to write code, not to regurgitate answers.
sure.
So like, my compilers class, for example, the project at one point I think was 70% of the class, and that's
Wow.
writing a compiler for that produces JVM bytecode.
Hmm.
And so it's pretty intense. You have to learn. I teach recursive descent, and then you do everything by hand, and it's really good for a student if they do it to just crank through it and figure out how to work with a big code base and so forth. And students would occasionally cheat by like finding like old repos that I tried to make them public or private, but then someone would make it public and blah blah blah. And I would always change the compiler slightly so that like I'd sit down and someone's code is not compiling. I'm like, you're using an old API because you've copied this off. But I think now that they have AI agents like that are pretty good, and especially for something like a relatively simple recursive descent parser that's generating a well-documented format like JVM bytecode. They don't, AI just makes it so that they don't have to do it if they don't want
Hmm.
to. They can just, they can get 100%. And so this semester, actually, I really started noticing this like 2 semesters ago, but this previous semester was crazy. Like everyone everyone got A's on all the coding assignments. Like
Wow.
just everyone got an A, 100%. And it's like, okay, well, that's clearly not realistic. So what I'm doing this semester is I'm making the projects 50% of their grade instead of 70% in
Mm-hmm.
some cases. And I'm making the quizzes 50%. And the quizzes are going to be in person and pencil on paper,
Mm-hmm.
with no digital help, no computer, no phone, no anything. And then the quizzes, I'm going to make them easier, so that they're not, quite as intense as they were previously. But they're going to be in person, and you're going to just have to know. I'm going to do a lot of like code annotation, like tell me what each line of code is doing in this code block, stuff like that. So that's how I'm trying to address it, is just by flipping. And one thing I've commented on this, I think it's ironic because the universities, deservedly so in many cases, have gotten sort of a bad reputation as like not being as useful as they once were for like preparing people for the real world.
Sure.
Um, and I think ironically, we've got all this like historic legacy infrastructure for in-person tests.
Right.
And that might end up actually being useful and making a college degree useful in the future, because like in 3 years anyways, if they've gotten a degree and taken 3 or 4 classes from me and gotten A's, that means something, because that means they got A's on quiz, like they actually knew something to write it down on a piece of paper. So kind of one of
Right.
those historical ironies.
I mean, I guess the previous equivalent of that would be, you could make the argument like, hey, give the kid access to their IDE and autocomplete and all that stuff, because in the real world they'll have access to that, and don't force
Right.
them to write, pencil on paper, because that's not realistic. And of
Yeah.
course, you can make the same argument now. It's like, well, yeah, they're gonna have access to AI tools at their job if
Right.
if they're working in the real world. So why prevent them from doing that? But at the same time, the whole point of the course is the concepts. It's not like,
Hmm.
can you cause this artifact to exist? It's like,
Yeah.
can you understand conceptually so that you can
Right.
build bigger and more complicated things in the real job?
Right. Yeah.
Um,
I
and
think
that's,
there's,
yeah, hard.
yeah, well, there's two things in my classes. There's the conceptual stuff, but then there's also just writing code. And I think
Mm,
writing code is like, yes, right now we're probably at like the maybe, I don't know. I feel like we're at the peak of like vibe coding where everyone's just prompting and whatever. But like, I use AI for stuff. I use AI for my classes because it's very good for generating like sample data, like sample problems and like schemas and all that stuff. Where it's a really good tool to leverage for that stuff. But it also makes just crazy bad decisions
sure.
at times. And if you don't know, like I when I built the latest version of the simulator, I was using Claude to help build parts of it, and then it's like I'd go and look at it and be like, "What are you doing? This is crazy. This is
Right.
crazy. This is never going to perform anywhere near what it needs to for an emulator." And so, go in, fix it up, and like refactor the whole thing. And if I wasn't able to do that because I've written a bunch of code, I think the project probably wouldn't have worked. Um, so that's what I tell the kids is like, look, you're getting an education. I'm going to teach you some conceptual stuff, but a big part of this is like learning how to write code. And,
Yeah.
you've got to learn to write code. It's like, drawing for artists. Like you got to learn to draw first, and then you can be a great painter, after that. And so, it's hard to enforce that. I do give them an agents.md that's like that's very specific about you're helping this student explain the
Mm,
concepts. Don't be a code generator. And
yeah.
my hope is that the students will, if they're smart, they'll use it, and if they're not very smart, they won't even notice. But they'll just be like, "Why is my AI not generating all the code?" It's because there's this agents.md that says, "Don't just be a code generator. Explain the."
Agents.md, which is in a thing called the file system, which you may not be
Right,
familiar
exactly. Like, so
with.
I don't even know if I'm going to talk too much about it, but I've got one of those plunked into the project, and just tell them basically. And it could be, this is the thing, is like it could be a very valuable TA, because one thing that I deal with is I'm at a public university that's it's a small, Montana is a low population state. not a ton of money flying around. And so I have classes with 100 plus students in it that, and I'll have one half of one TA for that. And
Hmm.
so I've automated everything. Like the
Yeah.
grading is automated, everything's automated. It's the only way to make this work. But what that means is I can't, I have office hours and students will come in and I'll talk to them. But like with 100 students, 7 homeworks, 7 quizzes, like I can't help the students the way that I would want to. And AI can, if it's done, if it's used effectively, can be useful as like a surrogate TA in that situation. And I think if we can figure out, I think unfortunately, for better or for worse, it falls to the student to, if you want to learn this, then you're in a great position to learn this in a very cost effective way. Montana State is not an expensive university to go to. And we can, but if all you want is the degree, then, especially previously, it was very easy to get a good grade in my classes because you could just cheat, on the projects. I'm trying to make that less easy so that now, like, okay, you can probably cheat your way to a C, but you can't cheat your way to an A in my classes anymore. You got to learn some stuff.
You mentioned that the old way of cheating was that people would look up on like a web archive or something and find an old
Hmm.
version of the project that had been posted and use that to sort of look at the solutions
Yeah.
and present that as their own work. I wonder if there's some equivalent that you could get into, like if you could design a project where basically there's some element of like you're not just trying to code against a spec, but and I guess this makes it harder to grade automatically, but something where you're trying to say like you have to do some amount of design and decision making beyond just how does the code generate this format, such
Yeah.
that you could experiment yourself and try to lay traps where you make the specification such that if you just give it to an AI agent, it spits out something that looks like it works, but actually does not conform to what you you know
Right.
requested.
Yeah, I always think of that T.S. Eliot line where, like, dreaming of systems so perfect that no one will need to be good is like probably not. I just think, like, and a lot of my students respond really well when I tell them, like, look, like, I struggled with this class. Like, this is what knocked me out of computer science for like a good 5 years. And I only came back to it because I felt like I had sort of failed in undergraduate. And, I think students, some percentage of them anyways, respond really well when you just be like, one thing I try to tell them is like, it's hard being a good person in the modern world. Like, we have phones, this awful phone, and like you go into a store, like, you go into some store and the colors and like it's all designed to make you make bad decisions.
Mhm.
They want you to make bad decisions. And so, and then, there's morality fatigue too. Like, if you're constantly saying like, I'm not going to eat the Snickers bar or whatever, then like you eventually break when it's like, okay, I'm under stress and I got to get this done and like whatever. Um, so I think acknowledging that explicitly with the students and being like, I get it and I'm sympathetic, and you are dealing with a world that I didn't have to deal with. The world I dealt with was a world that my parents didn't have to deal with. And just kind of like, I don't want to say treating them like adults because they're not really adults, but just being explicit. Like, I know this is hard. I know there's a huge temptation to cheat. Like, let's not do that. Like, I'm a good programmer. I'm a pretty good programmer anyways, and I can teach you to be a good programmer, but it's going to require you to, lock in and want to do it. And so if you haven't done that yet, then like, let's make that happen this semester in this class. I am doing one class with an open like back half where they're going to design it. And just like, you design a feature, you design the database schema, you do the styling for it and the UI for it and all that stuff. And so we'll see how that goes. But hopefully I think that addresses it to an extent. But then they can use AI to generate stuff too. So I'll
Right.
just ask them questions about the code. Here's some code you wrote. Explain it to me.
Yeah, I heard that was I think it was like an old Soviet style of examination where basically like examination implied oral examination where you just sign up for a time slot and you come in and talk
Yeah,
to the professor and they just ask you questions open ended and you have a dialogue
yeah,
about whatever the problem was. Um,
I
which
would absolutely love to do that. I would absolutely love to throw out everything and just do like a 30-minute oral exam with each student because I think I could give a fair grade after like a 5-minute conversation with most of my students.
is the
It's
challenge
like,
there. There's kind of like no paper trail where it's all subjective and
I think the challenge is logistics because if you got 100 students and
mm,
if it's 10 minutes a slot, that's 1,000 minutes, which
yeah,
is a lot of minutes. It's a lot of minutes.
yeah, a lot more than proctoring one
That
exam.
is- yeah, exactly. So
Right.
it doesn't scale. That's that that would be the equivalent of 16 hours
Mm.
of interviews. I would probably get pretty tired, so I'd probably need, and then so if 16 hours, and I've got 1 hour a week, or I've got 3 hours a week, so divided by three, so that would be 5.5 weeks of talking to students in a 15-week semester.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you'd save time on not having to grade the exams, but I'm guessing that doesn't take 15 hours.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to do it. I think it's the right thing. I 100% agree it's the right thing, but it's just not the way the university, our university anyways, is set up because, the finals
Right.
week, they want their blocks and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, maybe things like that might start to become more acceptable somehow, or maybe schedules might change
Yeah.
to accommodate it.
We can just have AI interview them, and then they can plug
I
their
don't know why I
AI
didn't
into
think
it,
of
and the AIs can just argue about, register allocation.
And then you can do it over video. So what they can do is that they can have a different AI deepfake themselves, and then the AIs can just
Exactly.
talk to each other and come up with a
Yeah.
letter grade.
Exactly. There's no right. It's like there's no system that can work without some sort of
Well, but like you
without
said,
people being good.
universities do have the infrastructure of like physical offices where you can't
Yeah.
actually, given the time logistics, you could actually have students just walk into your office and one on one have a conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. It's doable
In theory.
in theory. I'm gonna try paper quizzes first, and we'll see. Baby
Cool.
steps.
Well, I mean, best of luck with it. It sounds like, I
Thank
mean,
you.
the ancient curse of may you live in interesting times. These are certainly interesting times.
They are, they're very negative times. It's like, boy, I always go back to like poetry. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And I feel like the times we're in are sort of like that, where like, it's so many people are like, like this AI stuff, like it does do some useful things, like, so what does that mean? And then there's people that are super intense about like, this is gonna, like, nuke whole industries and like, almost a gleeful like intensity to that idea of like, I don't know, it's just, it feels like that time to me. Like, so, and I hope, I just I hope we get through it and then get to a spot. What I tell my students when they're, worried about AI is like, look, I don't think knowing how computers work is going to be a bad thing in the future. Like the working environment might not look like what it looks like right now, but it's hard for me to imagine a world in which knowing how computers work is like bad for you as like a career. Maybe, computer programming has some changes or whatever, but like computers are are probably here to stay. So I don't
Yeah.
think we're going to go into a world where like 10 people understand how computers work and no one else does.
Right. And I wonder if I mean, tell me if this resonates with you, but I was thinking about this in terms of automatic memory management, where, like you mentioned, like back in the PDP 11 days, everybody knew how memory worked. That you just had to. You had a constant. You know how registers worked. You knew about
Yeah.
cache misses, like all that stuff, because you just had to make software at all. That was just the
Yeah.
baseline.
Yeah.
And then we got automatic memory management. And it became mainstream, and eventually you get to a point where not only some, but the vast majority of programmers can totally get by having almost no or maybe even no idea how memory works at all. You're just like, I don't know, I just make
Right.
strings and arrays and stuff, and it's fine.
Yeah.
And maybe that's horrifying to people who grew up with memory knowledge being a requirement. But one way you could look at that is, the total number of programmers kind of exploded, and a lot of programmers didn't have the same level of knowledge, but that's just because you just didn't need as much knowledge. But you could also observe that, the quality of software degraded, along with
Mm-hmm.
that. And especially when it comes to performance, and maybe these things are related, where you got more software being made faster, but a lot of it has worse performance and therefore a worse user experience. And I wonder
Yeah.
if we're about to see something similar happen. Like you mentioned, kind of like vibe coding being like this thing where you don't even look at the code. You just tell you prompt your way through everything. Um,
Hmm.
on the one hand, I buy that it's going to be possible to make software that works for, a common definition of works, in the sense that like it does do the thing on some level, but I bet the
Hmm.
quality is going to be worse than for
Yeah.
people who are using the AI tools with some understanding of what the code is doing, and like some awareness of what the machine is doing, and thinking about quality and focusing on quality. I bet if you have one tool set, and the other scenario, you have that tool set plus knowledge plus a willingness to engage with that knowledge, you're just going to make higher quality software that runs
Right.
faster and has a better and fewer bugs and stuff like that. um,
Yeah.
so it doesn't necessarily mean, I guess what I'm trying to get at is, if I were to make a prediction, I would predict that it doesn't turn out to be a binary, like all one or all the other. It's more like you
Hmm.
have tiers, just like you do today, where
Yeah.
some people are vibe coding their way through their entire careers, and the software that they're making is just a lower quality than the people
Yeah.
who are not doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's true. I view it in as much as I've used it, I view it as a tool, and I kind of like if I don't care about a piece of software, like so here's one area where I use AI a ton. Scripting integrations. Like I
Right.
work at a university and nothing works with anything. And so just as an example, like entering grades sucks here because the grade system and the CMS, which has all the grades in it, like don't talk to each other. And so there's this like panicked Monday after a semester ends where you go through, and when you've got 105 or 110 students, it's like, getting the grades across and making sure there are no errors is actually like a fairly difficult problem.
Yeah.
To the point that I would have like my kids sit down with me and like, okay, next blah blah blah, and they get the grade, and then okay, like read it all back and go back and check because I've given people the wrong grades at times. And I was always like, man, if someday I'm going to write a script that takes the CSV export from our LMS and writes the JavaScript to actually go through this like UI and like select the right grades. And I just never did it until this last semester when I just like threw Claude at that problem. I was like, here's what the HTML looks like. Here's what the grade file looks like. Create something that'll generate a JavaScript function that'll go through given this data and like flip all the grades correctly. And I did it, with a class, and then went through and like just did basically the same thing I've always done, but I didn't have to like click all these tiny little drop down targets and stuff like that. All I had to do was verify that the grades were correct. And
Right.
it did a good job of that. And that's a script that I could, I'm capable of writing that script because I understand Python and JavaScript well enough. But it would have taken me probably like, honestly, like 4 or 5 hours to get all the little details of it right. And so instead, I had Claude generate it for me in like, 20 minutes or whatever. And that, it's a script that generates a script. I don't care a whole ton about the performance or the quality
Right.
or whatever. And that made my life on that Monday significantly better. And so, I think you're right that like we have to be balanced about these things. Like there's good and bad. The environmental impacts of this stuff, this is like one of these like really, really difficult problems where you don't, especially right now, if we're not paying, that's one thing that does worry me is like right now, how much token subsidization is coming from VC. And so is this stuff going to get like, everyone's going to get addicted to it. And, first one's free. And then like, okay, now you're going to have to pay full freight for this. And it turns out to be really expensive. And then sort of that rug pull that might happen. We'll see. But
Yeah. I mean,
I
cost side, I am encouraged by the fact that there are lots of alternatives, and there's sort of like there's always one that's the best, but then there's also always one that's kind of like right behind it. So maybe if
yeah,
everybody rug pulls at the same time, that's like a problem. But even then, there's
yeah,
open source models that can run on any hardware that are also
yeah,
just like kind of a little bit behind, the
yeah,
frontier stuff. So I'm not as worried about that. But I mean, speaking of quality, like right before we started recording, we had a little bit of a technical glitch, and you commented like, you'd think this thing would just work since you're paying for it, which I am, the
Yeah.
recording software. And on the one hand, I do have, I believe, the technical skills to if I wanted to, I could roll my own competitor to the recording software I'm using,
Right.
but it would take me a lot of time, and it's just not how I want to spend my time. And somebody who's super AI hype might, turn to me and say, "Oh, you can just rub some AI on it, and then you'll be able to
Yeah.
build it in enough time." I'm like, yeah, but the thing I'm trying to do here is to improve the quality. It's not that
Right.
the recording software I'm using is like missing a feature, or like I want to reorganize the UI. It's like I'm trying to make it less buggy, and
Yeah.
I just fundamentally don't think that I can save myself enough time to if I'm trying to do the high quality thing, to make it a project I would ever consider how much time I would have to spend to do that. It's still an inordinate amount of time that I would have to spend, even if I'm
Yeah.
AI maxing as hard as possible, to try to actually improve the quality of the software. And I
Yeah.
think that that to me is, at least based on what we know today here in 2026, that to me seems like, yeah, I mean, there's going to be more software written, like that. You just gave a great example of like that software wouldn't exist except that you were able to write it with the aid of an LLM, because before the trade-off didn't make sense. But really high quality, professionally crafted software, is that just going to be a thing of the past? At least not based on what we know right now.
No. Well, I think high quality professional software is making it plausible that LLMs could do, because it's so bad now. This is just the problem. And this is, there's so many like, to me, these all are morality problems. Like, yeah, I think even economics, like this is just, I don't know, I don't want to get too spicy, but I think economics is a moral problem as much as it's
Mm.
like in the West, we tend to treat economics as a math problem. Like,
Mm-hmm.
just make the line go up and everything's good. And I think that there's a moral historically, before Locke, anyways. Like, economics was a moral science. I think Locke was a moral science, like was considered a moral scientist. So, but like to me, like just pet peeve, like OS X, what I would call OS X or Mac OS now, right? Like they need to fix bugs and make it work well. They don't need new features. They don't need new transparency. We don't need that stuff. And they don't work on that. They do, because
Right.
it's not sexy, it's not cool. No one wants to be the person who figured out why, like every millionth like instance of a JVM gets memory corruption in this one case when it loads this, because it's just hard work, and there's no flash bang for that stuff. And so
Right.
you have to be sort of what you're saying, which is like, I just want, like, this needs to be good software. There has to be like an internal commitment to that. And I think early on in the computer world, there was so much money flying around that mindset could exist. And I didn't appreciate it at the time. Like, there was a time when software just got better.
Yeah.
Like it just got better, and there was so much money coming in that the person that was like, we need to fix these bugs, we need to make this, like, they could exist in corporations in a way that I think is much harder now. Like, if you're a person that's like, stop adding crap to our product, the marketing people are like, what are you talking about? I've got to talk about something at the next whatever con. Like,
Yeah.
like, yeah, you can talk about all the like bugs, like, oh, it doesn't crash every time you open a file with this extension anymore. Who cares? Like, the marketing people don't care about that. And so there's this very difficult thing that I think is starting to get to the surface of our industry of like, how do we make good decisions about software? I'm saying this as a guy who just decided to like rewrite his library, but whatever. Um, and it's a very hard economic. I think there's an economic aspect and a moral, because I think those are the same thing. Like a moral aspect. Like, I don't know what the right solution is, other than encouraging people like you who say like, I just want like, just fix the bugs. I don't know how we do.
I mean,
How we
I think there
incentivize
is
that.
definitely a cultural element to this, which, I'm optimistic that maybe it's not likely, but it is at least possible to change this sort of cultural, element in programmers, which is like you mentioned in that blog post about like the one before the version 4 announcement. You were like, hey, I think this HTMX is just done. And what I read that to mean is like the design is done. It's like we know how we want this to work. We don't need to come up with new APIs for the sake of coming up with new APIs. And I think you even
Right.
mentioned like, look, maybe there's some things that could be done a little bit better, but it's just not worth the churn to try to
Right.
improve them in those ways. And maybe the inheritance thing at the time was part of that, but now you're like, since we're doing a breaking change, let's get this in too. But
Yeah.
I think about that from the perspective of what are the two things that everybody's always okay with a new release for? We fixed bugs and we made it faster. Nobody's ever like, I'm not upgrading to this patch release that fixes a bug unless maybe you were depending on the behavior of the bug, which is kind of a weird edge case there. And nobody's ever like, oh, you made it faster, but I'm not upgrading because I don't want it faster, unless maybe you're just
Right.
so security conscious that you're like, we don't want to take any chances. We cannot even touch this thing without reviewing it to the extreme. And even if it is faster, I'm not willing to chance that it's different even by one byte.
Right.
But by and large, people are like, hey, bug fixes make the software better. Performance improvements make the software better. Since
Yeah.
you mentioned calling it OSX, I'm sure you remember the famous Snow Leopard release where Apple
Right.
was just like, no new features. We just made it run better. And
Oh,
that was
can
celebrated.
you imagine? Like everyone was so pumped. It was just
Right.
like, this is amazing. Like,
The,
thank you
and
guys.
it's one of the most famous OS releases ever, I would say. I mean, like
Yeah.
in a positive way. There's lots of infamous OS releases, but when
Yeah.
people talk about like what are the OS releases that really knocked it out of the park, that one's always going to be part of the conversation for the exact reason that they were just like, we made it unambiguously better. There were
Yeah.
no changes for you to deal with. Everything worked the same way you used to. It just worked better. It was faster. They removed bloat, like everything.
Yep.
I mean, and that culturally seems like something that we could just get more on board with. We could point to examples like that and say like, hey, remember this time when people used to just make software unambiguously better because it was just faster and less buggy? What if we just said, as your project gets more and more mature, it's just culturally a norm that you just focus on making it. Don't try to churn things. Instead, what do you spend your time on? You spend your time on making it less buggy and run faster. And you start to incorporate more methodologies. You start to more tooling to find bugs more easily. Think like investments that maybe don't make sense at the start of the project. There's so much stuff you could spend your time on to try to get to a level where you're like, this software is just incredible how well it runs.
Yeah.
We don't have that culture today, but I'm optimistic that it is changeable, that it's something we could get to.
Yeah. I don't think LLMs are going to help with that cultural transformation.
Well,
I
okay.
do.
So
Go
so
ahead.
I think the counterpoint to that is that what's really annoying to set up is like the type of testing infrastructure that would help you find all these bugs, like formal methods type stuff, all those
Oh,
things.
yeah. That's
Those are
true.
in kind of the same category as the scripts you were talking about earlier. Like
Yeah.
I'm aware that I could set those things up for myself, but a lot of the time I don't just because it's such a hassle. An LLM
Yeah.
could make it less of a hassle if we had the cultural impetus to be like, that's what you're supposed to be doing with your time now.
Yeah, and that's a good point too. That's another area where I have used LLMs, which is for testing. Like, okay, here's some code, like I need some tests for it. And as long as you constrain it and don't let it get too crazy. I have a particular way that I like to test things, so I kind of have to like tell it, like, don't do it that way. Don't do the
Yeah.
unit test thing. Do a little bit, anyways. So yeah, that's a pretty good point. I would say what I always say about tests, which is you have to be careful with tests because they can commit you to a particular approach, and so if you just blast a bunch of tests into a code base, you're at some level setting in stone what that code base looks like at the moment you do that,
Very
and
true.
that might not be a good thing. So, but I do agree that that might be the case. I just I think I got in trouble on our Discord for saying this, but I think there's also a cultural aspect amongst engineers, certainly amongst marketers, always want something new. They're not interested in bug fix releases, right? And like speed, unless they can show like a really outrageous graph. They're not interested in 10% faster that makes everyone's life 10% better. It needs to be 100 times faster. But developers too, and I am certainly guilty of this. I think we don't want to do that work. because that work is like a ton, it's hard work, right? It's
Yeah.
like a lot of investigation. Then there's one line of code, or, it's, sometimes like you can tear out a whole system and it's great. But, but I think there's also just a culture in development, and it's in natural. Like you want to be creative, right? Like that's part of what being a programmer is creating new cool stuff. And so that polish phase is not that. It's a different thing. It's more of a sanding sort of craftsmanship. I got in trouble for saying like it's gold age versus silver age thinking, which, like there's the golden age of a particular technology, and then there's a silver age that comes afterwards where there's not this heroic, it's not this heroic situation. It's more like, okay, we've got something pretty good, and now we need to just sort of consolidate and sand and polish something. But I think I still, even though I got in trouble for it, I still think it's a reasonable way to talk about that. Like, and I think that's true. Like that notion scales for like things, like it's true for the industry, it's true for a particular project, it's true for maybe a particular feature, and you making that transition that you've talked about from like, okay, we're doing something new to we're maintaining something that's good and exists, it's a tough transition to make. So.
Now, having said that, I do think there like different people are interested in different phases there. Like some people are really interested in going from 0 to 1, like the thing didn't exist to something exists, and then there's other people who are a lot more interested in going from 1 to 2, where it's like
Yeah,
I'm coming in, this thing already exists, and I'm going to make it better. And
yeah,
maybe culturally, a thing that could change is just being more accepting of like maybe you just rotate. Like I'm here, I'm here at this company or in this open source project to get it off the ground, and I'm just
hmm
naturally assuming that at some point I'm going to wander off to get something else off the ground. And
hmm
conversely, somebody else might say, hey, I'm not even going to get involved in this project until it's gotten to a certain
yeah,
point, and then that's when I want to become a long-term maintainer and do the polishing and the bug fixing, the performance improvements and stuff. Because
yeah,
oftentimes having those two types mix at the wrong stage of a project, I think can cause like the project to not go as well. Like
yeah,
in the zero
100%.
to one phase, you have people who are like, I want to polish and make stuff like really gold plate everything, and the 0 to 1 people are like, no, 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 this is going to slow it down, and we might not even get to 1 if we slow down in gold plate at this stage. We really need to be a little more move fast and break things if we want to hit critical
hmm
mass to get it off the ground. And then conversely, if you still have the 0 to 1 people around after you get to 1, then maybe you have this problem of like, hey, why don't we build some new APIs and like
Right.
build new stuff for the sake of building new stuff because that's what excites me. And that's like
hmm
the 1 to 2 people are kind of trying to be like, well, no, 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 like we did a good job, we got the design down, let's just try to make it higher
Right.
quality. um,
Yeah.
some people are excited about both, but plenty of people aren't. And maybe if we, sort of acknowledge that more and made it more culturally okay to be like, yeah, you can just move from project to project based on your interests, maybe that might
Yeah.
help too.
I think so. I think the problem with open source, though, is that most people who get into open source are in that first category. And I think you need to be paid at some level for the second category because it's just, you don't get that endorphin rush of like, here's like the new
Right.
thing. And we tend to pay those people less, like maintenance, and a maintenance engineer, if that's in your title, is going to just, compared to like a, senior or whatever, is going to get paid less. And so
Yeah.
I think there's also a cultural acknowledgement, and then and companies, I mean, I think with open source in particular, like you really have to, you're going to rely on the first category to get anything out there. And you see this, like people get trapped in their open source projects, like, right,
Right.
because it's like, oh, I was so excited to do this thing and I got it out, and like, okay, that's the the first 90% of like 90% to get to where like the thing's actually done. And this has happened to me, like in projects. I'm like super excited about it, and it's like, oh man, now it's a slog. You got to do all the sloggy stuff. That's one reason why I decided to become a professor, is just to have more time to do the sloggy stuff. So there's a cultural aspect to it. There's a big cultural aspect on both sides. Not only the people acknowledging what type of engineer they are, or if it's possible for them to flip between those two sort of modes of thinking, but also companies recognizing that about their own products. And just, I don't know how to fix the incentives, and without the At this point, because people are unwilling to say like that's bad because that's bad, like, I think the incentives have to change if you want different behaviors. And in the short run, I don't see that happening. So, not to be pessimistic, it's all good. So there's lots of good people out there. So
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, it's like, if we want things to improve, step one is figuring out like what would improvement even look like. So, but I agree with you. I mean, I'm not expecting this to turn on a dime either. But I am at least thinking about like how could we turn it on some sort of denomination of currency if we wanted to, and where would we turn it to?
Yeah. No, I think you're right though. Obviously the first thing is, just understanding like, okay, there are multiple phases of life in a software project, and how do we prioritize all of them? And that first phase, that creative phase, has a lot of like intrinsic reward associated with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then later on in the project, the intrinsic rewards go down significantly. And so how do we fix that?
Yeah. I mean, one idea off the top of my head is just maybe we could try to sort of sing the praises more of people who are doing the 1 to 2 type stuff. Like we often talk about, I mean, I'm going to introduce you in this podcast as the creator of HTMX. Now, you're also the maintainer right now, but we typically talk more about the person who created the original thing, like JavaScript, for example. Brendan and I created JavaScript. It's like, name me any of the people who are involved in TC39 maintaining it. And if someone's able to name it, it's probably because they're famous for something other than being on TC39. And they just happen to know one of the facts about that person is they're on TC39. They don't actually know, like, this is a person who's maintaining one of the most, if not the most widely used programming languages on the planet. That's just not something that you are famous for these days.
Well, you say that, and there's a guy on the HTMX team, Michael. He's been absolutely unbelievable, and he's very much the 1 to 2 or like 1 to 100 or whatever. Like, he is an absolute beast when it comes to tracking down bugs and like working hard in the GitHub issues and stuff like that in a way that I have not been able to, just because we're getting my classes and everything going. And he deserves as much recognition as I do, but you don't invite him on, me, and because I created it and talked about it. And so it's tough. I don't know what the solution is. I think companies are in a better position because there's money there. Like in open source, there's no money. There's just very little money. And so companies could internally prioritize this in a way that that's difficult to do in open source projects. But open source, I just I look at Mike when he's doing this work, and I'm like, man, what a gift to just, like, he's willing to do it, and him being willing to do it makes me willing to do it. And he's been very not incremental. What do I want to say? He's been very it's just been an absolute gift to the project. So
nice. Well, give me some of Mike's details, and I'll link to them in the description too, because Mike, we appreciate you, and the world needs more people like you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Leighton, good old Leighton.
All right. Well, on that note, anything else we should chat about? We've been going for a while before we wrap up.
Yeah. No, I don't think so. I guess I will mention Big Sky Dev Conf if people want to come to Montana.
Cool.
He's going to be in late July. I think it's 25th, 27th. Let me look real quick here. Get a calendar up. July 24th and 25th. It's that last weekend in July. In Bozeman, Montana.
Cool.
And so keep an eye on bigsky.devcon.com. That'll be updated soon with a call for papers if people want to apply. And it's just a 1 day, like one track, 250 to 350 people. But it's a fun time if you want to come check out Montana and Bozeman. July is actually a pretty nice time to be here as long as there aren't too many fires. It's not too smoky. So. Not very hot.
I love conferences of that size. They're always a good time.
Yeah.
All right, Carson, thanks so much for joining me, and really appreciate having you on.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate you having me on, and I will maybe talk to you at some point in the future.
Looking forward to it. All right.
Cheers.
That's it for this one. I hope you liked it. You can find links to some of the things that Carson and I talked about in the description. And if you'd like to become a supporter of Software Unscripted on Patreon and get ad-free episodes, check out patreon.com/softwareunscripted. Until next time.